welcome. First, I want to thank our three panelists who I'll introduce in a moment. Thank you, the three of you, for taking the time to speak today, for taking time out of your work, including all your work in the community. Thank you for everyone for taking the time to be with us right now, everyone who's tuned in. And finally, thank you to Stanford University Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, which is hosting this conference and helped arrange this panel. So let me start by introducing our panelists, and then I'll get out of the way and let them share. So first, we have three people joining us. First is Jamie Garcia, who's a registered nurse and organizer here in Los Angeles. Jamie is with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Next is J. Khadijah Abdurahman, who's the director of We Be Imagining at Columbia University's American Assembly. And then it's Sucheta Ghoshal, who's an assistant professor of human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington. So we planned this panel, the three of us were thinking about the role of institutions like universities, academic research, and the broader technology industry in either supporting or sometimes harming the work of grassroots movement building, trying to dismantle harmful technologies, as well as the role of all those institutions often in advancing or strengthening technologies, including police technologies, technologies of war, and trying to think of the relationships between research, between kind of the ecology that surrounds the technology and the industry, and movements and grassroots work and community work to confront that harm. And as we talked about all that, we realized that there's sort of three concepts that I just want to put on the table as we begin, and I think we'll be kind of returning to them throughout. So the first concept is the notion of complicity and kind of thinking about what each of our complicity is in these systems of harm. And complicity, I think, is a good concept because it's not something that's just only some of us versus all of us or an on-off switch. I think of it as kind of a spectrum that we're all on, that all of our work and even just being situated in this country or being situated in institutions like universities have this kind of some kind of relationship to these systems of harm. And of course, universities can be a really clear vector of that. So we'll get into that. The next is accountability, thinking about who all of our work or our research or our advocacy or whatever we do, who is that work accountable to? Particularly what base and what base building is your work accountable to? Who are you kind of answering to? Who's holding you accountable? What systemic motives are at play? So those are questions that organizers, movement organizers, community organizers have to ask at every moment. And I think there's a lot to reflect on there and learn from there. The third concept like that is thinking about expertise and kind of authority. And in all of our work, whose expertise and whose authority is being centered? And are we uplifting the expertise of the communities who experience the harm most directly? Are we building that expertise? Kind of who has authority over how these systems are both built and then also kind of reformed and refined and renewed? So that's the backdrop. I know it's a lot. Before we get into that, I want to, on a personal note, honor a friend of mine named Hussam here in LA who lost 21 family members in Gaza in a single night on Sunday this week. So when we talk about police technology and race and abolition, we need to recognize the relationship to war. And the Washington Post reported about that killing, that the operation that killed his family was part of the Israeli military testing a new paradigm of data-driven warfare that they promote as kind of part of what they describe as the fourth industrial revolution and the use of automation and data mining in particular. So those are the stakes often of the role of technology and power and race and all and what we're talking about. So I just wanted to name that, and let's just give 5 seconds of silence to honor that. Okay, thank you. So let me start by just asking each panelist to introduce themselves a bit more and share about your work. So in particular, I'd love to hear from each of you share your relationship to abolitionist movement building and what abolition means to you. I'm going to start with Jamie, since I've known you the longest, and then, we'll go down. So go ahead, Jamie. Jamie, you're
So
on
there's the techno flaw, right? Are we good now? Okay, so there you go. Modern day Luddite. That's what the coalition has been called sometimes. So my name is Jamie. I am first a registered nurse. I work in the community of Boyle Heights, just east of Los Angeles and very close to the Skid Row community of Los Angeles, one of the highest concentration of people without homes, and a very poor community, predominantly Black community. I've been organizing with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition for about 10 years. So coming up on the 10-year anniversary of the coalition. So most of my work in the coalition, I guess starting in about 2016, was really focusing on data-driven policing. At that time was being called predictive policing. Prior to that, it was really understanding what intelligence-led policing was becoming in the United States post 9/11, post the Intelligence Reform Terrorism Prevention Act, understanding the key elements of behavioral surveillance, data mining, and how the Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative nationwide was impacting law enforcement and building on police violence and surveillance that had already been existing for decades in the United States. So a lot of my learning and the organizing with the coalition was really looking at the architecture of surveillance, which is a pop ed tool that we have that really looks at all the different kinds of surveillance equipment and analog, behavioral monitoring that the LAPD did. And then in 2016, the coalition kind of reorganized itself into more working groups that were building campaigns, and I helped facilitate the campaign against predictive policing, 2 campaigns, PredPol and Operation Laser. Both, it's controversial. LAPD claims that Laser was not a predictive policing program, though it does drive itself using crime data, anything associated to gun violence, and also uses a risk assessment that's based on a point system. And as we know, and we've learned that algorithms are essentially math problems. 1 + 1 = 2, and you got an algorithm. And PredPol used a fancier algorithm, the ETAS model, to predict where crime would happen. So through that campaign, really kind of just started diving into understanding this automation, its impact. And I think, and I don't want to take too much time because I can start talking forever, is that I think what really happened in this group was really kind of, for me and for the community, kind of really learning how to do community-based research and analysis together. How to build that power together, and realize that our goal was really building a culture of resistance, filing public records requests or FOIAs together, writing reports together, actively in discussions for hours and hours, talking about the impacts of data-driven policing. Then realizing when we thought we figured out all the true impacts of data-driven policing, realizing we were missing things out or missing components of it. And I think that was one of the biggest things in the coalition, was the development of the algorithmic ecology and our new analysis that's adding to the predictive policing concept of just the ratchet effect that, algorithms just, basically create a feedback loop, but realizing too that they, how they're kind of geographically mapping containment and banishment zones. And so really correlating that to land. But, and it really adding to our understanding of abolition. And I'll end right here, but just realizing that it wasn't just, us coming together, seeing who's in the room, developing an analysis, but really when we think about abolition, kind of stepping back and realizing we couldn't center the algorithm, the technology, or the risk assessment, that we had to look at everything that's involved in manipulating and utilizing that technology, because that essentially allows you to see the true impact of the technology. And so when we think about abolition, we have to keep all those things in mind, all those institutions that are complicit, because those are the institutions we're coming after as well. And those are the institutions that we're looking to dismantle, to expose, to hold accountable. So abolition isn't just the ending of police, but it's ending of people and institutions that are complicit in allowing police to kind of increase their funding and their violence in communities.
Thank you, Jamie. And I'm going to come back to a lot of what you shared there. Next, Khadijah, do you want to introduce yourself and talk about, relationship to abolitionist movement building, what abolition means to you?
Sure. So much here. So, I mean, a few things. I mean, one, when you were talking about Gaza and just overall, I've been thinking a lot about Joshua Bennett's work. He's a poet. One of his books is The Sobbing School. And he says, who can be alive today and not study grief? And I think, so much of when you're talking about mapping out this ecology is talking about mapping out an analysis of tech and power. And that's something that's very much obfuscated when we use terms like racial bias or even just automating inequality. And shout out to Virginia Eubanks. I do love her book. And like something that I've really been thinking about is how originally the book was supposed to be titled The Digital Poorhouse, but the publishers really pushed for this automating inequality. And like similar to the algorithmic ecology, what I like about the conceptual framework of the digital poorhouse is it allows people to see how new infrastructures of social control and surveillance are being built up through these kind of algorithmic logics. It's not just a question of it's like disproportionately harming or misidentifying or inaccurate, but it's that new infrastructures, new forms of control are happening. And when Eubanks talks about the contrast between the digital poorhouse and this brick and mortar poorhouse at the turn of the 20th century under this like modern day progressive movement, right? She says, the digital poorhouse, you have people classified and sorted prior to being physically co-located together and then spread across time and space. So that preempts this ability, what we saw, and then even later on in the 20th century with the Rainbow Coalition, but this kind of cross-racial solidarity. And so I think about what happens at the moment when, the caseworker is coming into the apartment and entering in this demographic data and automatically doing these risk assessments on a tablet using something like Safe Measures Dashboard, which is something that we see in LA and something that we see in New York City. And it's already placing, the full dynamic like experience of what it means to be human and what it means to be in relationship with your community and your family into these finite categories and modes of being that is not just in their narrative, like rhetorical power foreclose kind of different possibilities, but have like geographic implications as far as where people get located and what becomes politically possible. And so I often tell people that I'm a child welfare system abolitionist. I do feel like we need to abolish all policing and all systems of harm. But I say that because our there's a civic discourse around mass incarceration that just here and there, child welfare is starting to come in the middle of it. But I don't think that we've really grappled with how the carceral turn and the social safety net is actually like central to this carceral continuum. And I'm just like, I'm almost ambivalent now about the term abolition because I think we're getting close to that point where like Ford, I'm sure Ford is probably already funding something like this. And is getting evacuated of any of its meaning. And again, when I'm thinking about the family regulation system, I'm thinking about how can we map out this power? Like we say some cops are called caseworkers and literally child welfare, child protection services can operate like the police, operates juvenile detention centers, just like we have prisons, operates residential centers, just like we did to the indigenous people during settler colonialism. But it also, the regulation, I don't know if we've quite understood when we're looking at Ma'Khia Bryant, murdered by an agent of the state when she was in custody of the state, and her mother was is a certified nursing assistant in a city and a state where, like, when Clinton abolished or ended welfare as we know it, mandated people to work for their welfare benefits and contracted out to private corporations and nonprofits to do job training that often pushed people into becoming CNAs or into becoming security guards that were then contracted out by the same government services. I don't know if we've fully grappled with what that means, that it's not just enumerating the violence and all the multi-system involvement, and these are all the things that they were exposed to, but like, can we actually synthesize this into an analysis? Can we not just take a moment to breathe and pause to grieve for what's going on in Palestine, but can we really take a moment to pause and grieve that the Atlanta PD is being trained in Israel? Can we actually really begin to map these connections between the NSA and AT&T and Google, and not just talk about, because when we're thinking about complicity, we actually have to understand the relationship between these things. And it's not just funding disclosure, but what are the roles of these think tanks? What are the roles of these research centers? And, you know, as somebody who does grassroots work, like at the end of the day, unless we're organizing trust fund babies, we got to eat, right? We got to take money from somewhere, right? But what is the matrix of decision making when we know that these foundations, like such as Annie E. Casey Foundation, who are the intellectual architects of child welfare policy, what do we do with that information when we know when they're funding us, it's also infiltrating us. It's also capturing information about how we operate that informs the degree to which organizations are identifying to fund at 10 times the rate so they can suppress our movements. So in conclusion, I would say that, yeah, I'm all the way down for abolition, but I think that we really got to pause and think about what is the full breadth of what we need to dismantle. And because I could talk a lot, I don't want to say too much more, but also I just wanted to say that Sucheta and I are co-founders of the Otherwise School, developing tools and techniques of counter-fascism, focusing on South Asia, Tigray, Oromia, which are two regions of Ethiopia, and the Black US South. And a lot of these are questions that we were wrestling in, like developing the scope of the school. And one of the aspects is, you know, we are so America-centric, and having this conversation around abolition and having this conversation around policing, and areas that I feel like are underattended to are questions of genocide, mass atrocities. You know, how do we address something that has been typically called war crimes or crimes against humanity? You know, and knowing that, like, what are the implications of those criminal logics? I don't have all the answers, but I would just put out there, like, expanding the scope beyond just the US.
Thank you. Yeah, Khadijah. And I want to come back to especially thinking about this moment that we're in with abolition now, where, you know, after the uprising last summer, it's this there is all this attention to it and funding for it, and what that means for kind of what is a revolutionary ideology committed to kind of dismantling of so much of society, but yeah, what it means for it to become this branding. But Sucheta, I want you to introduce yourself and just share about what abolition means to you.
Sure. Speaking of about like policing technologies beyond the US, my work started in India. With the Indian government deploying Aadhaar, which is the unique identification system that was largely, it was motivated by several different things, but the real effects on real people, even though it was presented as like a welfare a pipeline, it still ended up being a massive surveillance risk, and anything that is related to biometrics, it had its own massive privacy risks, massive security risks, as well as like for the Indian government. This was deployed by the Modi government, for a government which was not known for its acceptance of all of its citizens. The other was continuously used for religious segregation and caste segregation and all that. So my work started from protesting this technology, which was documenting the biometric information of individuals in a country that most people like barely have experienced technology in an intimate level before at all. So to have that sense of recording of biometric information without actually knowing where that information was going, or without having any mode of refusal to it, was really concerning, and that's how my work started. But at the same time, like I realized as I was working in India that most of these conversations around protesting a technology, policing technology, also have the risk of having like experts and non-experts speaking on this, and the experts being people who are familiar with technology, people who have computer science degrees, people who are in a privileged position to understand how a technology works and functions. And that happened with Aadhaar as well. Like protesting the technology became a thing or a cause for a select few of the country, when the other massive population was being forced to enroll in it without actually really knowing what they were getting into. So that kind of like sets the context for why I came to the US, and I wanted to study. I really like when I came to the US, I talked about how I really wanted to be in the US South, and I wanted to understand policing, not just policing technology, but technology of power from at the epicenter of technology of power. And I feel like the US South, especially the Black US South experience, has been really the institutionalized violence that happens in the US and in the southern part of the US is like nothing else. I think it is really like something that is novel and something that is continuing to inform the global violence that happens with policing technology. So my work with my PhD started by me being involved in abolitionist movements here in the US South, Black-led movements in the US South, and I wanted to see how this global South experience with technologies of power I can inform, or I can be of support in any way with making these connections between the global South and the US South movement organizing. And one of the things that I was trying to do was, in its experience of policing technologies as well as abolitionist techniques and everything, I think the US South experience has been largely a part of the global South experience as well. And that's one of the things that I have tried to pose as my analysis of abolition, that we should try to think about the Black-led experience, Black and Indigenous-led experiences of the US South with policing technologies and with abolitionist organizing in the framework of broader global South organizing against policing technologies as well, which is something that you all already shared sort of, but I would like to add that specific point to that broader framework that we are trying to talk about. The thing that what abolition means to me, I think what abolition means to me is not defined by predictive policing or policing technologies. What abolition means to me is something that communities have always practiced. They have always practiced safety and accountability in our own ways that had nothing to do with state-sanctioned policing or state-sanctioned security services or anything like that. I think what abolition means to me is tapping into those inherent knowledge and ways of being that we already have as community that have had to create accountability for ourselves. This is not like, again, this is not I don't think it's an invention of mine. It's just what communities already practice. Communities like Spirit House organizing, which an organization that I closely organize with in North Carolina, Durham, they practice harm-free zone, which is basically founded with this idea of how we can declare a neighborhood, a region harm-free by just creating our own tools of accountability and safety, where we not only take care of people who are harmed, but we also take care of the people who harm us in our communities and create accountability, therefore. I would end at that, but I think I'm excited about what Jamie and Khadijah said and how we can have these conversations and create a broader global framework for abolitionist movements.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I want to come back, exactly, just on that last point about thinking about kind of the understandings and even you can use the word technologies that our communities have always had, and how that is the kind of how you think about at the center of abolition. And And yeah, we're talking about technology, like, and we're talking about predictive policing, we're talking about digital technologies and computing and all of that. But what I hear all of you saying is a need to kind of decenter the technology and to think about the questions of power and politics that surround them, the social determinants of people's harm, as well as this point about kind of the technologies that are inherent to us. So Jamie, I want to come back to you. Khadijah talked on this point about how these systems the child welfare technology systems, they're built on obviously caseworkers doing things like collecting reports, like doing kind of physical, personal surveillance, and that's when if you just focus on the technology, you're missing the broader kind of infrastructure of harm. And I know you've talked about policing in that way too. So, but I want you to kind of connect it a little bit to what you started saying about health and your work on in around public health, and thinking about, obviously even with health, we have technologies, we think about devices and procedures, but there's also kind of policies and social conditions that shape health more than anything. And that those social determinants of health are kind of what's often missing from the analysis, even and then when people focus on technology and improving whether it's public health surveillance or improving like the technologies of healthcare delivery, what they're missing about the social context and even some of these kind of ancestral technologies and knowledge that has always existed in our community that people are thinking about. And that seems, I think, helpful for thinking about abolition. When you think about abolition of the medical industrial complex in that way, why is that helpful for thinking about abolition of carceral systems and policing? Sorry, that's a lot, but go ahead.
And I definitely don't want to simplify the issue. Also, because I think we're held hostage by a lot of things. And so there's sometimes when you're talking from a place of privilege, and I think we all sit in it, especially being able to sit here in the US. And if we're young and we don't have disabilities and we don't have chronic illnesses, we sometimes are not the visibility of being held hostage by like certain systems sometimes can be forgotten. And so one of the things that you're saying that I've been really thinking a lot about, and where my work is now shifting, and I will be kind of like no longer purely focused on like LAPD and policing, but is more looking at surveillance through public health and through the medical industrial complex. But if we were to put, kind of what you're saying into context of what we're kind of calling, and I think a lot of people are using this term as well, is this idea of Techno Solutionism, right? And I might go in a lot of directions, but because this is all still really developing in this group and kind of in the context of looking at this current pandemic we are dealing with, right? And so some of the research that I've been kind of getting into and looking at is genomic surveillance, right? And looking at the COSAC, that's happening in UK, where they're basically looking at every variant and kind of looking at, what variants are popping up. They're doing that in the US. All county hospitals now have to report a certain amount of data to the state, which kind of is doing it nationally as well. When we start to kind of step back and look at these systems that are being developed because of this emergency, we know that Palantir has gotten, so many new contracts under the guise of COVID, right? Because of COVID. We know that Palantir and we know that the Department of Health, now they want to, or Health and Human Services, they want access to people's medical data. They want access to hospitals' resource data because they want to be able to not only handle like a pandemic or surge again when it happens and know how much resources everywhere, but they also want to start to be able to track where COVID outbreaks are happening. So when we go back to the understanding of the variant, most data that you deal with, that is your HIPAA data that, different, public health scholars or health scholars will deal with is de-identified data, right? Because they don't want to geolocate you. They don't want to know your name. And they just want to deal with the data of that issue, right? And what was interesting is about a month ago, I was starting to find information from the head of the CDC, and I forget what his name is. And granted, I'm like in transition and all this research right now, but he was saying that, we can't have de-identified data or use de-identified data anymore. We need to identify the data, identify the person, know where they live, know what vaccine they have, know what happened to their health history in order to have any control of this pandemic, right? And so a week ago, we just got word that HIPAA is changing their health policies and they're relaxing health policies. And for everybody knows, like HIPAA is basically one of the most stringent like laws that protect all your health data, right? And so that's like really important to know, because part of who I believe I'm speaking to in this audience are people that want to build technology that's safe, build technology that will help us, with various issues in our lives, right? And the vaccine and this kind of genomic surveillance is a technology. The vaccine is a technology that we're held hostage to for those of us who have chosen to take it, because the pandemic isn't over. No matter what the CDC is saying right now, it's not over. And it is, we don't know where it's going to go, and we don't know how bad it's going to get, right? Because, and this is what's really interesting too, when you look at the history of the CDC, it's actually an institution that was created by the military. Right. And their whole thing is that they have to protect global commerce. They have to protect not only the idea of colonization where you're protecting the worker, but they have to protect the ability to transfer goods, to make money, and find ways to, protect people, in a sense, public health, whether it's international or local, and make money doing that as well. So we all know that the vaccine isn't going to resolve it, right? Even though right now they're, doing human studies on a corona vaccine to vaccinate us from all the coronas, right? Because, even the common cold is a coronavirus. That's we're always going to be in this perpetual pandemic, right? And it's like, and being a nurse that is seeing the people of East LA come in dying, dependent on me to use the Western medical technology to save their lives. I mean, there's one thing too, in which I completely am in when it comes to when people say ancestral practices, and sometimes we say ancestral technologies because practices isn't even good enough for people to, legitimize as medicines that people used. But we also have to realize that our communities are also held hostage by some of these systems. And so we are held hostage to the vaccine. We are held hostage to different types of technologies in the medical system. Like, it's cheaper for Medi-Cal to cover your amputation of your leg than it is for them to prevent you from the diabetic issues that you had that led to that amputation, right? They're more likely to do that than they won't do that. And I'm digressing a lot, but it's kind of interrelated when we think about the technologies that are supported in these systems and how they and what end they will protect, right? And they'll protect certain ends because there's profit in that. So it wasn't surprising to me to see now HIPAA's laws being relaxed. It's not surprising to me to see Palantir now involved in starting to organize our medical information, to organize the resources that hospitals have. And this idea of genomic surveillance it's really, to me, just a guise to a lot of private industries are going to start making money on kind of supporting this ability to do this, right? But it's further mapping, it's getting more of our personal information, and it's not solving the problem. And that's the biggest thing, because if we really wanted to solve the problem, then everyone would be staying home right now, whether or not the numbers are low, right? We'd be staying home, we would be getting paid or getting our resources that we need for food, for shelter. We would be reconsidering how we're educating our children so that they can be safe and get the education they need. All the basic things that we have been calling for as social justice organizers for so long would be being attended to, because we know, as all epidemiologists know, that those are the things that people need to be healthy. But that's not what technology serves, right? Technology is there to serve the bottom line of making money, of protecting capitalism, and for containing and controlling and knowing who is where, and to control those movements. Like the EU just passed or just did its verbal agreement on the digital certificate for vaccinations for movement through the EU. So now we have borders within borders, and everyone says, oh, well, we've done the immunization passports. Yeah, but we haven't done them with the might of surveillance technologies and with the data processing systems that are developing and refining themselves on us right now, in the communities of Skid Row, in the communities of Palestine, that they've been refining them, right? So that's kind of some of the things that brought up. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a lot of stuff that's been on my mind. It's really hard to separate my identity as a nurse from these conversations sometimes.
No, thank you. That's perfect. And yeah, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is, it's, as you put it, this ideology of Techno Solutionism sees, they see these harms in our communities, and the answer is, okay, if we refine the technology, if we refine the surveillance, if we refine the data mining more, or even fix the problems with those things, then that's what's going to serve. And that's what there's so much investment in, rather than the real kind of social determinants of health, the things that actually keep us safe, that we've always known about. And that's what communities are calling for being invested in. Instead, there's the turn is always to, oh yeah, it looks like there's a problem with the technology. Let's invest more in improving the technology. And that's exactly kind of how we see it in policing too, is whereas communities are saying, you need to invest in us, and you need to invest in the things that actually keep us safe. That's housing, that's healthcare, that's schools, that's parks. Instead, what the technologists or the people kind of even focused on technology, or even focused on privacy or rights in the context of surveillance, they're thinking, okay, how can we improve or strengthen or fix the technology, rather than, no, what we're saying is that we need to be taking as much as tools and resources out of the hands of police, and investing all of those resources instead in the things that keep our community safe. And I mean, in LA, the LAPD spends over half the city's yearly discretionary budget. That's all money that can be going to other things. Technology maybe makes what police do more efficient, but that's not what we're calling for. We're saying take the money away. And even you mentioned Palantir. Palantir is a technology company that is kind of instrumental in it creates data mining and data integration that was first kind of developed by a CIA investment arm and has been used to run the drone assassination program in Afghanistan. That's a program that Palantir Technology, LA spends millions of dollars on it every year. And again, that's all like, instead of thinking of, how do we make that more fair? How do we make that more efficient? What people are calling for and have known and is obvious to communities, but is just ignored, is we need investment in our communities, not improving this. So on that, I think I want to go back to Khadijah and some of what you were talking about kind of even what abolition is coming to mean now, and kind of the questions of power and ideology, like we've been talking about in political economy that you raised, and what it means that, abolition has always been, and especially, the thinking of it that developed, led primarily by Black femme thinkers and organizers and Black trans women organizers through the last several decades, framed around as an analysis of how reform and attempts to reform, refine, improve policing through the years have just expanded the police state. And, the work of Naomi Murakawa is kind of really telling that story over time. And so when you talk about, and when we see now this moment when all these foundations and universities are willing to embrace suddenly the language of abolition, is that kind of, what is it, what do you see happening with that? And what do you see kind of, the transformation of how abolition, what it's always meant versus kind of what movements are supplying versus the role of kind of these shock absorbing institutions or kind of accrediting institutions and going with it in their own direction?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I'll try my best to answer each one. Just to step back for 1 second, I think it's interesting, Jamie, that you said people refer to you as a Luddites. And colloquially, that term is often invoked to mean somebody who hates technology. But what was the Luddism movement? They were breaking the machines because they understood what that particular technology represented was a reorganization of labor that was going to increase their wage exploitation. And so for me, and I only speak for myself, but I guess I would make a distinction between technology and computation. I'm not actually anti-technology. A lot of times we think we're anti-technology because we're receiving technology that has been produced by major corporations that were initiated by foreign or US-based intelligence officers, right? But I don't think inherently that's what technology is. Like I come up against this also in thinking about like content moderation and platform governance. A lot of the content moderation conversation has become about identifying and deplatforming or suspending bad actors. And that reduces platform governance to ostensibly policing, right? And like, what does it mean to be governed? I mean, we think about like, if we're going to talk about like Black femme abolitionists, immediately I think about Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who makes this very important point that the other side of the coin of mass incarceration and enclosure is abandonment by the state. And what does it mean to be governed? What does it mean to have like a set of infrastructures and administrative processes that are like life-giving? I think that's very hard for us to imagine because every single interaction and every aspect of our society is so hyper-policed all the time. But of course, not the same for everybody. It's policed enough that like incredibly privileged people who are attending a webinar with Stanford know what I'm talking about, but we don't all equally, experience that type of harm, right? And so what does it mean when we center the most impacted? So like a lot of people, I have like a pen pal that is currently incarcerated, and I was writing back to them today and they sent me a letter. And they was like, yo, it's my birthday and I turned 40. And, like I'm one of the few of my peers that made it to 40. And I'm so grateful, but I'm mad that I'm locked up. And then he was saying something along the lines of, like, I don't know if you guys watch this. My son has autism. He's like super obsessed with the show. It's Blackish. And on Blackish, they had an episode that was the talk about policing. And he was like, that just feels so elitist. He was like, clearly you're not from the neighborhoods where like talking ain't no buffer, but you don't never have a choice. You don't even have a chance to talk, pull out a candy bar and your life is gone. And so, I don't feel the need to go to him and like raise awareness about policing. And I know that we have a lot of like existential anxiety about like the capturing of signifiers and oh no, the CIA understands intersectionality and oh no, like they're capturing, the word abolition. But I mean, I think, yes, they'll capture all the signifiers, but function over signifiers. Like ultimately, I think that the question with the intersectionality in the CIA videos, intersectionality doesn't just include that woman was Latinx and has an anxiety disorder. It also includes that she was an agent of the state that has blood on her hands. And so I don't think that we should be like over anxious about when these things are stolen to a degree. I think we have to center the problem. And so we have all these movements, let's free Mumia, let's free all these people who are locked up and they still locked up. We're not freeing nobody. We're not winning. Ultimately, like for me, like my politics is I do want to win. And I don't think that winning is like that amorphous and that existential. Can I see exactly what it's going to look like? No, but I do know that it looks like the police are not coming at my door. And I do know that it does not look like computing. I do know that it does not look like artificial intelligence, because the moment that you're deploying artificial neural networks, or you have public adoption of automated decision-making systems, what is the first demand? The first demand is data. It needs massive amounts of data in order to make these insights. What is the difference between computational thinking and a scientific method? To quote my friend Jeanette Wing, she said the old scientific method, we go out, we ask these hypotheses, and then we go iterate and experiment, and then we develop conclusions to see if our hypothesis is correct. The new method, computational thinking, no, we don't have to do that. Just bring me your data sets, and then we will extract insights to make a hypothesis. And what does this mean now in public health, right? How does it get us to attend to the problem? Who does it recruit as experts to address the problem? If we're thinking about COVID-19, I think it's important, Jamie, the way that you point out those parallels to post 9/11, Patriot Act, and how we have the state overreach, and people are too exhausted, frankly, and dying and grieving and overwhelmed even to sometimes like mobilize resistance against it. But I think that also if we're going to think about COVID, we have to deal with the fact that like we do, in some ways, we've hit like what Marx wanted. We have these like the means of production are like globally socialized, but unfortunately it's in the interest of capital. COVID, we can't understand it happening without understanding how we went out and we changed the whole ecology for bats. And now we have like mass air travel and all. We have a relational society that like wants to be governed as if we're atomized individuals. And so that's why we don't have this urban planning that is like life-giving. We have urban planning that's giving us lead poisoning, that has like a fetal ecology where people are prenatally exposed to neurotoxins. And then when they have damage to their prefrontal cortex that limits their ability to like inhibit their impulses, they're murdered by the cops. And then we have protests that go out and did what we're supposed to do because we radical, and we march along with the police. And then the police throw their drones and they track our data, and then we write articles about it. And then we talk to our friend because he works at the think tank and he just got some Google money, and they push out some white papers. And we go to the webinar at Stanford and we look at the Andrew Mellon Just Futures thing. And we be like, that was a good webinar. We live tweet on the timeline. And we're going in these circles. And so what I'm trying to say is that I think we have to look at like, what are the parameters of all of our discourses, whether we be grassroots organizers, whether we be baby mamas or computer scientists, or whether we be in, the Bay or Brooklyn or North Carolina or whatever it is, right? And because we need to win, and I'm not sure we're on that track, but I do think that it is possible. And I do think it does require technology, but I also think braiding hair is a technology. And not because it's representation politics, but in that moment, we're transferring information across generations. We're taking time and we're slowing down. We're having slow scholarship. But that is the self-care that Audre Lorde was referring to. The self-care was not girl boss Meghan Markle, go. Like, that was not it. But we do need to invest in and produce life.
Yeah, word. No, I mean, I think, okay, I want to bring this then, based on what you're saying, to thinking about collective study and kind of that as the work, and that's, I mean, for the Stop LAP Spying Coalition, I think, in addition to kind of community organizing, direct action, the main thing that I spend my time doing, and Jimmy spends the time doing, is sitting around learning with others, learning from others, teaching. And really, I mean, when you're talking about what does it mean to win, it's I don't know that. I don't know exactly what that is, but what I know about is kind of, being involved or trying to help build a culture of resistance, and that kind of learning from each other and even just understanding, and then also then centering and uplifting the expertise of the community, which I want to connect back to Sucheta on that point, and what Khadijah was saying about Blackish and the talk, and just kind of, even when we talk about expertise on these, on technology, on these harms, it's obviously the privilege that comes with that. And even when you were talking about the Azhar system and how, the critics of it were these maybe kind of more bourgeois or kind of elite criticism, while at the same time the people being most harmed don't have that same voice. And I mean, even in with surveillance and technology, so much of, and I think of this especially as a lawyer, so much of how we talk about the problems of surveillance is through, and so much of who's doing that political work is kind of elite professionals, whether they're technologists, lawyers, policymakers, thinking about privacy or thinking about legal rights. And that's kind of the critique or resistance that's centered the most. Rather than the way people are actually experiencing it, which, is privacy is not a notion that most people have access to. Instead, they're thinking about maybe along the lines that Khadijah was talking about, or even just thinking about being controlled or being just watched in every aspect of their life. So just, I know, Sucheta, a lot of your work has been about this kind of thinking about community-based research, participatory research, and kind of, so can you just share about, research that's embedded in that way and the relationship of technology?
Sure. And I think I actually think that the most authentic and rigorous critique of technology has come from the people who would be traditionally by the academy called as non-experts, and the people you would like to study because they are at the margins of society. I to this day, I think the most sophisticated critique of technology and automation has come from Black Panther Party and their lumpen ideology, which is very much what was their experience of technology? But I mean, I don't know exactly how exactly they were experiencing technology, but you can tell how they were experiencing technology from the writings of and the predictions they've made about the future. And it's not academia tries to frame it as access, as people who are poor, people with low resource communities and all that. We need to reach out and give them access to technology, and somehow that will solve something. But I think my research, at least, has led me to believe that people with who we traditionally call as low resource and people with like low access to technology, they often like have the greatest critiques of technology because they have, even if you do not have access to Facebook, you have more access, or more, you're more likely to experience surveillance because of policing technologies that are so pervasive. So the access problem doesn't actually, the digital divide or the access problem doesn't make sense to me at all, because how, folks who are currently being, currently trying or like wanting access to technologies like Facebook, technologies like Twitter, are fully aware how surveillance works because of their life experience, because of where they are in the society. And I mean, I see that a lot in my work as well, like not wanting to use Facebook for movement organizing in the rural South because they're concerned about policing and surveillance at a traffic light, right? Like they haven't experienced Facebook at all, but they have experienced what it means to be watched, what it means to be fundamentally, not having that authority to be who they are. And so what social media and opportunities, digital technologies, and all those opportunities mean to the people who have already been betrayed by technology, digital technology. But I think like I would say that I would take a step back and I kind of like pushing on or like piggybacking on what Khadijah said about, this is nothing like this is not the only technology that we have at our disposal. It's not just the predictive policing or Facebook or Twitter. Like the digital technologies that we see are not what defines technology or what the space is about. Like she said, the braiding hair is technology. I think food is technology. It's an amazing technology that sustains communities. Community gardening is a technology that I think that like is literally the organization that I'm also quite close to, Project South, have been feeding during this time of COVID, have been feeding the whole neighborhood with, community gardening and farming in a space that is primarily food desert. So people know how to sustain themselves in the worst case scenarios. And even though it's not like winning in the ideal condition, like if you're living well and eating like well, even with all of this coming at you and everything trying to make sure that you do not survive, that's something that is winning. And so people are in their small ways, even at the worst of conditions, still winning and celebrating life. And I really don't think like we have to go very far to find out like how there's no magic to it. The magic is just like people know how to live and like they know how to take care of each other and they're not concerned about profit or control in making sure that they live and take care of one another. One thing that I will say, though, like Cedric Robinson says this in Black Marxism, that capitalism, for it to succeed, has always needed surveillance. So I think the one big reason why we do not have technology without, I cannot imagine technology without surveillance, is because we cannot imagine capitalism without surveillance. And we have not made we haven't gone so far as to imagine technology without capitalism. And so like if like any and every technology and its existence is dependent upon capitalist logic, then of course we'll have surveillance as long as that exists. Because that it's a very effective, surveillance is still a very effective profit-making scheme. Participatory research, I think, is one of those inherent technologies that we have. Like, I don't think it's just about like academy finding a new topic. I think it's like how communities have sustained always and known how to like make sense of a problem together. That's what participatory research is, and communities have done it for a long time. I think it's just now the academy is finding value in it.
Yeah. I love this point about, yeah, like we haven't imagined technology without capitalism, and also even knowledge production and what you're saying now with participatory research without capitalism, or at least most of society doesn't. Obviously, the kinds of research we're thinking about now, and guerrilla research and collective research, is that. And yeah, thinking about technology without capitalism, I mean, I think it goes back to what Khadijah was saying about, I mean, the Luddites were attacking technology, but more than that, I mean, they were attacking the capitalist order that they were experiencing technology in. And so that's kind of, yeah, I think, so coming back and thinking more about this collective study and research, I mean, I'm Bengali, so I have to rep. I think of it sort of as subaltern kind of knowledge production and organizing. I want to just ask you, Khadijah, and I know you have to jump off. We'll have to wrap up soon. About, again, this like building up collective study and expertise and guerrilla research. We were talking last week about the patents owned by the new head of Google's AI division, and how, because of, like, even just as we're thinking about the role, and a lot of those patents are related to voice over IP, and how we might not have seen the connection between voice and IP into surveillance in a way that might be very obvious from the perspective that Sucheta is now talking about to communities. We're thinking just about even just associating technology with the surveillance that they experience non-technologically. So can you touch a little bit on that guerrilla research and collective study, Khadijah?
I have to go pick up my child from kindergarten in about 4 minutes, so I don't know if I can address all of these. But one, I mean, as far as like Marian Croak, who's at Google Ethical AI, I mean, it's just fascinating to me that kind of the firing of Timnit Gebru and all of that aftermath was like the most highly reported event in tech journalism for the last 6 months. And, nobody read Marian Croak's patents. And I don't know. I've had people try to shoot at me. Maybe that's why I would look up my nemesis. I just think that, I don't know. I used to joke around that like techno-capitalism puts people in charge of humanity that have never read the humanities, right? And so when we're thinking about people who have computer science PhDs, or even, I think about this with the development of like the atomic bomb, right? Like, what did they do? They sat there and they built a whole bomb. And like at the very last moment, they were like, let's write a letter. Let's put together a petition. And then went to the White House, the same people who was about to drop the bomb. And was like, maybe not a good idea. Like, people might die. And then like 2 weeks later, Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, right? And so I think that like I think we're in danger of just remaining in this deadly repetition when we just like critique the parameters of that from which we are without. And so I think if you are a technologist and you are a computer scientist, you know what are the range and like the specifics of that local discourse, and that you need to push that against the grain, because we're dying out here. There's pandemics out here, like genocide is happening. I mean, like Google is not just full of well-intentioned people, neither is Facebook. They're out here profiting from and recommending genocide and hiding the evidence. I mean, when Karen Hall wrote that like incredible article, but like several times repeated like the well-meaning good intention, that was like clearly technologists in the professional managerial class do not remember the crack era. Like, you have not felt what it means to be best friends with somebody that's selling genocide down your block and wiping out generations. Like, this is real. These are the stakes. And I just want to say, like, I don't know, sometimes I don't even need more radical. I just need like less complicit. And I just think we have to think about what these technologies hail. And people are like, oh my God, Khadijah, you read so much. I don't spend a lot of time on Zoom. And, like everybody says how much they hate Zoom, but we just like cede control to it. And you too can like read so much if we get off of this hell site. Like, it really is not necessary for us to be in this voluntary surveillance footage all the time. And what does that foreclose? And what does that make possible when we get off of Zoom? You would have more local interactions and relationships. And with that, it's 3:29. I appreciate y'all. Think about me during the grand cycle. Meet your neighbors.
Thank you, Khadijah. All right, 1 minute. I'm going to give you the last word, Jamie, if you want to talk about, I mean, all these ideas of community-based research and cultural resistance are things that I really learned from you and others in Stop by Peace Buying. So yeah, if you just want to end on that somehow.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And, it's, I've always been very intimidated to be in spaces like this because so much of what I learned about like police technology, surveillance technology, even being able to say Intelligence Reform Terrorism Prevention Act, right, was from community meetings, was from being in Skid Row, was being around folks. And I think for me, very personally, just realizing that a space like LA CAN, Los Angeles Community Action Network, where I gravitated to post-Occupy, that houses Stop LAPD Spying, a place where, in the city, they say, the area of Skid Row is where, it's so demonized, where, the lowest, when you're lowest part of your life, when you are, just so much is going on with you. And, it always, to me, I always feel like I always have home. Like there's always somewhere that's not going to give up on me, no matter where I'm at in my life, right? And so it was in that space with people I met, like Steve Diaz, like Hamid Khan, like Pete White, like General Dogon, that embraced and just bring you together. And it's that collective learning that I think is amazing. And it's in those spaces, I think, like Sucheta was saying, that you just keep each other alive. You keep pulling each other up. And, for me, like, that's what it is, because I'm just a nurse. I can, diagnose a murmur, but everything else I learned was in community.
Thank you, Jamie. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm going to hand it over to Daniel Murray to wrap us out.
Thank you so much, Shakir. Thank you to this panel, really provocative, challenging, both of our panels today, really, I think, pushing us to think about whose tech are we talking about, whose knowledge, and how do we produce and use knowledge. And I think really calling us to action. So a lot to think on, a lot to do. Thanks to the panelists and to the panel organizers for bringing that conversation to us today. And I want to invite everybody to make sure that you stick around or rejoin us at 4 p.m. Pacific today for our keynote, the conclusion of the conference, the 16th annual Ann and Lauren Kiva Distinguished Lecture with Professor Ruha Benjamin, really a leading thinker, doer at this intersection of racial justice and technology. We hope you can join us. It'll be right here again on our website. And thanks again, everyone. We will see you this afternoon.